what is part of the question here is what part of the marital estate belongs to Mica. And that's what we've got to get to next.
We are learning brand new allegations regarding a South Carolina pastor accused of pushing his wife to take her own life. We got our hands on court documents filed by John Paul Miller's ex-wife that may give insight into what his relationship was like with Mica Miller in the last parts of her life. Plus, we learned what will happen to evidence from the scene as her family faces off with her husband. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Hey, everybody, this is a Law&Crime legal alert. Google Incognito tracked users' browsing data without their knowledge. Yep, well, Mass Tort Alliance, one of our legal sponsors, is actually helping users file for compensation due to Google users' privacy issues surrounding Google Incognito. So if you've used Google Incognito anytime since 2016, you can start your claim in less than 10 questions at incognitoclaims.com/sidebar. We have been closely following the story of Mica Miller here on Sidebar. This is the 30-year-old woman who is married to John Paul Miller, a pastor at Solid Rock Church in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And out of the blue, back in April, John Paul Miller announced during a sermon that Mica was dead. He said that she had taken her life at a state park in North Carolina. And Mica, we know, was seen on security video purchasing a gun at a pawn shop before she drove to Lumber River State Park, where she was found dead. There is even a very chilling 911 phone call that was released where you hear Mica telling dispatch that she is going to kill herself and wants her family to know where to find her. The medical examiner eventually ruled Mica's death a suicide, self-inflicted gunshot wound. But after the news broke of Mica's death, her family and friends seemingly were immediately suspicious. Friends, family, they alleged that John Paul, who is 14 years older than Mica, they alleged that he groomed her from the time that she was a teenager and he was a youth pastor. They also claimed that John Paul was abusive toward Mica. And in fact, Mica had posted on her social media in the weeks before her death, offering her support to victims.
So you don't have to stay in a abusive relationship, whether that's sexual, whether that's somebody forcing you to take illegal drugs or alcohol abuse or physical abuse, psychological abuse, making you think that this is all your fault, or you're a bad mom, or you're a bad wife, or you're a bad husband, or you're not giving it your all when you know you are. God hates divorce, but why? According to everybody I've asked and the scriptures that I've found, it's because it hurts people. But does abuse hurt people? How do you think God feels about that?
That video is from March of this year. Mica took her own life in April. John Paul and his father, though, and we have to be clear about this, they have both maintained that Mica suffered from severe mental health issues and she may not have been taking her medication. It should also be noted that evidence supports that he wasn't even in North Carolina when Mica died. And to be clear, he has not been criminally charged with anything in connection with Mica's death, and there is nothing to indicate that he is being investigated in connection with Mica's death. But we are now getting a better idea of what life may have been like in the Miller household over the last year or so, thanks to something that we weren't quite expecting. Documents filed in family court by John Paul's ex-wife, Alison Williams. So we're going to take a closer look at those. At the end of May, Williams filed a verified complaint in support of a request to modify custody, child support, and alimony. And we learned from these filings that Alison and John Paul were married for 16 years and share 4 children together. 2 of those children are now emancipated, according to court records, and 2 are still minors. The divorce was finalized in October of 2015. But according to the final legal agreement, the parents shared joint custody of their children, with Alison being the primary custodial parent. The kids lived with Alison and would have visits with John Paul. Now, the first claim listed in this filing is for modification of child custody. That final divorce order stated that any sort of changes requested on either side would have to go to mediation first. But this complaint from May states, quote, that plaintiff asserts that based upon the exigent circumstances that currently exist and the possible imminent danger and harm that could be caused to the minor children, it is not in their best interest to delay these matters from being addressed by the court on an expedited basis, and good cause exists for the court to waive this requirement. It continues, plaintiff alleges that since the entry of the party's prior final order, defendant has exhibited increasingly unstable behaviors, failed to provide a safe and stable environment for the minor children during his periods of visitation, and has exposed and involved the minor children in incidents of domestic dispute and discord, which have been traumatic to the minor children and not in their best interest. It appears as though defendant's mental health has increasingly deteriorated, and he has exhibited behavioral patterns that are erratic and irrational. At times, he has foregone his designated periods of visitation based upon his own assertions of not being mentally well enough for the children to be in his care. Wow. So for these and other reasons, Alison is requesting that the court grant her sole custody of the two minor children. Now, John Paul had told people that it was Mica's mental health that was suffering, and perhaps it was, but according to Alison Williams here, it seems that he was also struggling. At least that's what she's claiming. And then from there, the affidavit takes a turn. It says, quote, plaintiff further alleges that based upon information and belief that since the entry of the party's prior final order, despite his representations otherwise, defendant has failed to seek treatment for his deviant sexual addictions and behaviors, which he admittedly confessed to both plaintiff and former elders of his church. Based upon information and belief, defendant has continued to engage in deviant sexual behaviors and has exposed the party's children to an immoral and unsafe environment. Wow. Deviant sexual addictions and behaviors? Complaint references a separate document that goes into more detail, and we're going to get to that in a moment, but wow. The affidavit then talks about Mica, who Alison says was having an affair with John Paul while he was still married, and I'm going to get into that a little bit more too. But it says, quote, the current wife of defendant Mica Miller was recently found deceased, the tragic facts and circumstances of which have become a major focus of social media, local and national news. Against the objections of the plaintiff, the defendant has discussed this matter with the children. Plaintiff further alleges that prior to the death of Mica Miller, she confided in plaintiff, sharing intimate details regarding the behaviors of the defendant and concerns regarding the safety of the minor children while in the care of the defendant. Plaintiff contends that until the time of Mica Miller's death, she provided a safety net for the children during their periods of visitation with defendant, and based upon her recent tragic death, that is no longer possible. So Alison asked the court to require John Paul to undergo a full and complete psychological and parental fitness evaluation. And until then, she wants his visitation rights suspended. These are very serious allegations, by the way. Now, in her second claim, Alison requests a guardian ad litem to be appointed. And generally, a guardian ad litem is somebody who's appointed by the court to represent the interests of someone who can't do it on their own. So she's asking for a guardian ad litem to be appointed to investigate what would be best for the kids here. Now, the third cause of action, the third claim, asks for or seeks a modification of alimony and child support, saying that there has been a substantial change of circumstances, namely that John Paul is now making more money. And she's also asking for a restraining order. So essentially, he can't talk bad about her to the kids or discuss any of these legal cases to them. I mean, she mentioned how traumatic this is. And also, interestingly, she apparently wants to stop John Paul from allowing the kids to talk with his father, their grandfather, Reginald Wayne Miller, who we've talked about on previous sidebars. Remember, he told the media that Mica was a very, very sick young woman. So it's interesting that, you know, she doesn't want these kids exposed to him. So that's a lot to digest, but we're not done, because in the accompanying affidavit that Alison Williams submits, there's even more. At the beginning of the affidavit, Alison says, quote, I have a voluminous amount of evidence to support the concerns and allegations contained in my verified complaint in motion. However, Until such time as proper safety measures are in place, I am strictly limiting the amount of information shared in this affidavit and provided to the court. She states that in 2015, JP was the pastor of Solid Rock Ministries, and I served as his assistant to pastoral duties. We separated after I learned JP was having an adulterous affair with our former nanny, Mica Miller, who joined our church at the age of 15, was married to JP's best friend, who was also on the church staff and serving as our church worship leader at the time of the affair. JP told me that in addition to his affair with Mica, he'd employed prostitutes and been sexually inappropriate with several underage female members of our church. He blamed his immoral sexual behaviors on the sexual abuse he experienced for years by his father, Wayne Miller. The church requested that JP enroll in an extensive sexual addiction program. However, despite him promising that he would, to my knowledge, that never happened. By the way, that adds to the idea of why she is advocating that the kids not be exposed to JP's father. I mean, that is a very serious allegation against him. But the filing goes on to state, quote, after JP informed me that he had been inappropriate with minor female members of our church and disclosed to me the identity of these girls, I immediately contacted them to encourage them to come forward. Although each shared with me detailed accounts of what JP did to them, they were too scared of JP to make a police report or testify in court. When I learned they were too fearful to report JP, I went to the police department for the purpose of making a report and requesting an investigation. However, I was in essence told by police officials that nobody would believe me because JP was a well-known pastor and we were in the middle of a divorce. Following my divorce from JP, he married his then paramour, Mica Miller. Prior to my knowledge of this sexual relationship with Mica during our marriage, both she and her husband at the time, Jeremy, became very close to my family. Mica did not have a close relationship with her mother, and to some degree, I took her under my wing as an older daughter. So that might explain or might help to explain why Mica would have felt comfortable confiding in Alison about any alleged abuse she may have been suffering or any irrational behavior on John Paul's part. Again, these are just allegations, but I have to make that point. The affidavit continues, quote, JP and Mica began having severe marital difficulties, and our children were placed directly in the middle of this discord. JP would preach sermons on the Sundays our children were with him and present in the congregation, disparaging Mica and indicating she had mental health issues and eventually putting her in a mental hospital. The children were subjected to JP calling Mica crazy one day, and then her being back in the home at their next visit with their father assuring them she was fine. They never knew what to expect, and the intense unpredictability and marital discord between JP and Mica negatively impacted them all. On one occasion, while picking up our daughter, I observed holes in their walls, hinges off the doors, and pieces of paper taped to the wall with negative affirmations about Mica. JP told me and our children that Mica was delusional and speaking different languages and seeing things that were not there. JP agreed it was not safe for our children to be in his home. So at this point, Alison says the kids stopped staying overnight and instead would just spend a few hours at a time with John Paul, and he would then take them back to Alison's. And then you gotta hear this. Quote, JP began spending time with his new paramour, Susie, who is the mother of one of the boys that plays on our son's soccer team. JP began using our son to facilitate times he could spend with Susie, which our children were well aware of. Their friends talked about it, and it caused them a tremendous amount of embarrassment. When I learned JP was exposing our children to yet another one of his adulterous affairs, I confronted JP and Susie and told them not to let it happen again. JP called me the day Susie's husband died in an alleged drowning accident, extremely upset and asking me to pray, which was incredibly bizarre. Based upon information and belief, just 2 weeks prior to this incident, Susie's husband had confronted JP and asked him to leave his wife and children alone. It's chilling to know that the spouses of both Susie and JP are dead from tragic events. What exactly is she saying there? Now, before we get to this next part of the affidavit, a little bit of background. So our court research and reporting indicates that in 1998, Miller was charged in South Carolina with assault and battery of a high and aggravated nature, which is currently defined as when someone unlawfully injures another person and great bodily injury to another person results, or the act is accomplished by means likely to produce death or great bodily injury. Now, he ended up pleading guilty in 1999. He was sentenced to 500 hours of community service, and he was put on probation. His 4-year prison sentence was suspended. But then in 2022, South Carolina court records indicate that Miller was pardoned for that assault and battery case. And that is what Alison talks about next. Quote, he informed me, meaning John Paul informed me, that he was getting into buying guns and shooting, and he had purchased a gun safe for his home. As a convicted felon, he is not allowed to have weapons. However, he managed to get a police chief from the church to assist with expunging his record. Further, he was given a special police badge that says pastor to utilize it if he ever gets pulled over, so they'll let him go. Alison says, quote, I was married to JP for 16 years. Although my story and what I lived through with JP is different in some ways, many of the details shared with me by Mica are so similar to my own experiences with JP that I know she was being truthful. Based upon information and belief, JP's mental health and deviant sexual addictions have only worsened since the time we were married, and I do not believe our children are safe in this care. Wow. So with that, here's the question. Why does all this matter? Well, aside from the fact that this, of course, matters for the lives of Alison Williams and the couple's children, this matters in terms of the Mica story because we are trying to understand what the possible dynamic was between Mica and John Paul. There have been allegations that even if he didn't pull the trigger, John Paul is somehow responsible for what happened to her, responsible for her mental state. Now, to be clear, these are just allegations from Williams. We cannot verify all of these details. This is one-sided. And by the way, even if some of this is true with respect to what Williams experienced, we don't know exactly if this is what Mica experienced. But there is another reason this is all important. One, the fact that in South Carolina, my understanding is there is no statute of limitation on criminal cases. Prosecutors can bring cases for all different sorts of crimes at any point in time if the evidence is there. That's my understanding of South Carolina law. And a lot of what was just alleged could potentially be criminal conduct. So is it possible John Paul could be brought up on charges? It's a question I have to ask. But remember, he's innocent until proven guilty. He's not been charged with anything. But all of this from Miss Williams is also important in terms of an ongoing legal battle. What do I mean? Mica's sister, Sierra Francis, who we've spoke to previously on an episode of Sidebar, was appointed to represent Mica and her estate. And on Wednesday, her attorney met with John Paul's attorney as they tried to resolve issues over what Mica left behind. And during a news conference afterwards, family attorney Regina Ward gave an update.
We were prepared today to bring forward our client's affidavit, as well as other supporting affidavits, as well as I'm sure that Mr. Miller and his attorney were too. However, under the circumstances, we've decided to enter into this agreement. One of the primary issues that we were seeking a court order from the judge is possession of Mica's personal property that's being held in the possession of Robeson County Sheriff's Department. That property will be released from the Robeson County Sheriff's Department, or if they've put that property with somebody else, another investigative authority. When all authorities are finished with that property and have no longer any use for it, in other words, they've finished up whatever investigations or whatever they need that property for, then that property is going to be turned over to my office. It will not be released to Mr. Miller. And that does not mean that he doesn't have the right to see what's on a cell phone, which we're all interested in looking at. We also don't know what else may have been in the purse or the wallet or anything like that. His lawyer would be able to ask us about having access to it too. But right now, we are very satisfied and happy that he has been advised by his attorney to allow us to get that property in our possession.
Ward also explained that there were restraining orders in place on both sides.
In this particular case, the restraining order basically is saying that the parties are mutually restrained from contacting the other, that all communications will be handled through the attorney's offices, so there's no need for any direct communication. We're also under a mutual restraint to not go into the area of a person's residence or where they work, and if they do, they're to return and leave if the other person is there. So whoever is there first gets to stay, and the other one needs to turn around and leave. Everyone is also restrained from making any, threatening, any physical harm or anything like that. By us entering into these restraining orders, please do not misconstrue. That does not mean specifically that someone has already done these types of behaviors. These are formalities that are put into place to protect all parties prior to anything like that happen. So we have not, let me make it clear, not had any problems with Mr. Miller trying to contact anybody or anybody trying to violate any of these terms. These are put into place as a formality on the front end for the protection of all parties involved. It also makes clear what the boundaries are, and then if anyone violates what's written in this court order, they'll have an opportunity to file a contempt action or a rule to show cause. No one goes to jail on site for violating this particular type of restraining order.
And it also seems that the family is pushing new legislation. According to Ward, they are looking to pass something called Mica's Law, aka the Coercive Control Bill, which, according to Ward, has been sitting dormant since 2020. And she claims the law would address patterns of domination, intimidation, manipulation in relationships that don't just manifest through physical violence. But again, John Paul Miller hasn't been found guilty. He hasn't been found liable with respect to any of these allegations. So not sure that title, Mica's Law, would necessarily work if this legislation does, in fact, move forward. Now, look, we're going to continue to follow the Mica Miller story. A lot of disturbing details. But once again, thank you for joining us here on Sidebar as we cover this. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.